Sarah Mitchell had spent the last 8 years of her life surrounded by silence, the kind of silence that only exists in the dusty corners of Boston Public Library, where sunlight filtered through tall windows and cast long shadows across endless rows of books. She was just another face behind the circulation desk, stamping due dates and helping elderly patrons find romance novels. But on this particular Tuesday morning in November, that silence would be shattered forever. At exactly 9:47 a.m., 3 men in dark suits walked through the library's main entrance, their footsteps echoing against marble floors like gunshots in a cathedral. Sarah looked up from her computer screen, noticing how their eyes swept the room with practiced precision. Something about their movements made her stomach clench with a familiar dread she thought she had buried years ago. The tallest man approached her desk, his hand already reaching inside his jacket for what she somehow knew would be a federal badge. Agent David Torres flashed his Homeland Security credentials with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had done this countless times before. His voice was low, controlled, designed not to cause a scene among the morning patrons browsing nearby shelves. "I, Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell, we need you to come with us immediately." The words hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she set down her coffee mug, the ceramic making a soft clink against her desk. "I'm sorry. There must be some mistake," she whispered, but even as the words left her lips, she knew there was no mistake. The other 2 agents had positioned themselves strategically around the circulation area, cutting off any potential escape routes. One of them was speaking quietly into a radio, his eyes never leaving her face. Torres leaned closer, his voice dropping even lower. "Ma'am, you can cooperate willingly, or we can make this more difficult for everyone involved." Through the library's tall windows, Sarah could see more black SUVs pulling up to the curb, their tinted windows reflecting the morning sun like dead eyes. 20 minutes later, Sarah found herself in the back of an unmarked vehicle, watching Boston's familiar streets blur past the window as they headed toward an unknown destination. The agent sat in stony silence, offering no explanation for her sudden detention. Her mind raced through possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. She had been so careful, so methodical in building her new life. 8 years of perfect anonymity, 8 years of blending into the background like wallpaper. But as they drove deeper into the city's government district, passing buildings she recognized from another lifetime, Sarah began to understand that her past had finally caught up with her. The car pulled into an underground garage beneath a nondescript federal building, the kind of place that existed on no tourist maps and appeared in no phone directories. As they descended into the concrete depths, fluorescent lights flickered overhead like dying stars, casting harsh shadows that reminded her of interrogation rooms and classified briefings from a career she had tried so desperately to forget. The interrogation room was exactly what Sarah had expected. White walls, metal table, two-way mirror, and the persistent hum of ventilation systems that seemed designed to drive people slowly insane. Agent Torres sat across from her, a thick manila folder positioned between them like a weapon waiting to be drawn. He opened it slowly, deliberately, revealing photographs and documents that made Sarah's blood run cold. "Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell," he began, reading from what appeared to be a classified dossier, formerly Sarah Elizabeth Chen, Intelligence Analyst, CIA Operations Directorate, 2008 to 2015. The name hit her like a physical blow. She had legally changed it after leaving the agency, had constructed an entirely new identity built on lies and carefully forged documents. But here it was, her real past laid out in black and white like evidence at a crime scene. Torres continued reading, his voice devoid of emotion. "Who specialized in counterintelligence operations, held top-secret SCI clearance, worked on Project Nightingale under Director Marcus Webb." At the mention of Nightingale, Sarah's hands clenched involuntarily. That project was supposed to have been buried, its files destroyed, its participants scattered to the winds and sworn to eternal secrecy. The photographs Torres spread across the table showed Sarah from her CIA days, younger, sharper, wearing the kind of severe business suits that marked someone as a serious player in the intelligence community. But it wasn't the old photos that terrified her most. It was the recent surveillance images, Sarah entering the library, Sarah at her apartment, Sarah buying groceries at the corner market. They had been watching her for weeks, maybe months, documenting her every movement with the patient precision of apex predators stalking their prey. The interesting thing, Torres said, pulling out another document, is that when we went to retrieve your complete file from Langley, we discovered something unusual. Certain pages were missing. Pages that contained information about Project Nightingale that should have been destroyed in 2016. He leaned forward, his eyes boring into hers. But they weren't destroyed, were they, Sarah? You kept copies. You took classified documents when you left the agency, documents that detailed illegal surveillance operations conducted against American citizens. The accusation hung between them like a loaded gun, and Sarah knew that her carefully constructed world of library books and quiet anonymity was crumbling around her like ancient parchment. Sarah's mind raced back to those final days at Langley, when Director Webb had called her into his office for what he claimed would be her exit interview. She remembered the weight of the hard drive in her purse, the classified files she had downloaded in the weeks leading up to her resignation. But it hadn't been about money or blackmail. It had been about insurance, about protecting herself from the kind of people who made inconvenient witnesses disappear into unmarked graves. Project Nightingale had been a massive illegal surveillance program, targeting American citizens without warrants, collecting data on journalists, politicians, and activists who posed threats to certain corporate interests. Webb had assured her that all evidence would be destroyed, that the program had never officially existed. But Sarah had learned long ago never to trust the promises of men who traded in secrets and lies. She had kept the files as her insurance policy, hidden them where she thought no one would ever think to look. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said finally, her voice steady despite the chaos in her mind. Torres smiled, a cold expression that never reached his eyes. "We searched your apartment this morning while you were at work. We found the safe." The revelation hit Sarah like ice water in her veins. If they had found her apartment safe, they had found the decoy files she had deliberately placed there, but they obviously hadn't found what they were really looking for, or this conversation would be happening very differently. Torres was fishing, trying to get her to reveal the location of the real files. The ones hidden in the last place anyone would think to look for classified CIA documents, inside a hollowed-out copy of The Complete Works of Edgar Allan Poe on shelf 813.54 of the Boston Public Library's fiction section. She had been protecting those files for 8 years, maintaining them like a gardener tends to deadly nightshade. They contained evidence that could bring down not just Director Webb, but senior officials at Homeland Security and the Pentagon who had authorized illegal surveillance of American citizens. The safe was empty, Torres continued, watching her face carefully for any tell, any sign that would reveal her hand. "Which means you moved the files recently, which means you knew we were coming." His voice grew harder, more threatening. "Where are they, Sarah? Where are the Nightingale files?" The question echoed in the sterile room, and Sarah realized that her next words would determine whether she lived or died. Outside the interrogation room, Director Marcus Webb paced the narrow hallway like a caged predator. 15 years of running black ops for the CIA had taught him to expect complications, but Sarah Chen's reappearance threatened to unravel everything he had built. Project Nightingale had generated hundreds of millions in off-the-books funding, had given him leverage over senators and Supreme Court justices, had made him one of the most powerful men in Washington. But it had also been completely illegal, a violation of constitutional rights that would result in congressional hearings, criminal prosecutions, and the destruction of careers spanning decades. When Sarah had left the agency in 2015, Webb thought he had contained the problem. Her resignation had been voluntary, her exit interview had gone smoothly, and all official records showed that Nightingale had been a limited, legal intelligence-gathering operation. But Webb had always suspected that Sarah was too smart, too paranoid to leave completely empty-handed. Intelligence analysts were trained to think 3 moves ahead, to prepare for contingencies that others couldn't even imagine. And Sarah Chen had been one of the best analysts the agency had ever produced. Through the one-way glass, he watched Torres continue his interrogation, knowing that time was running out. Word of Sarah's detention was already spreading through certain circles in Washington, generating questions that Webb couldn't afford to answer. Sarah sat in silence for nearly 20 minutes, letting Torres sweat, letting him wonder if his intimidation tactics were working. She had been trained in counter-interrogation techniques, had learned how to read the micro-expressions that revealed an interrogator's desperation, and Torres was definitely desperate. The way he kept glancing at his watch, the subtle tremor in his voice when he repeated his questions, the fact that he hadn't yet threatened her with federal charges or indefinite detention. They needed her cooperation, which meant they were operating under constraints. Someone higher up the food chain was pulling strings, applying pressure, demanding results within a specific time frame. "I want to see a lawyer," Sarah said finally, breaking the silence like a stone thrown through glass. Torres laughed, but it was a hollow sound without humor. "You're being held under the Patriot Act, Sarah. National security concerns supersede your constitutional rights." But even as he said it, Sarah could see the doubt in his eyes. The Patriot Act had been used and abused for decades, but using it against a former CIA analyst who hadn't committed any provable crimes was legally questionable at best. "Then charge me with something," Sarah replied, her voice growing stronger. "Show me evidence that I've committed a crime. Because sitting here answering your questions without legal representation makes me an idiot, and whatever else I might be, I'm not an idiot." The door opened and Director Webb entered the room, his presence immediately changing the atmosphere like a storm front moving in. Sarah's blood went cold as she recognized the man who had recruited her, trained her, and ultimately driven her from the agency. He looked older now, grayer around the temples, but his eyes still held that predatory intelligence that had made him legendary in intelligence circles. "Hello, Sarah," he said, taking the seat next to Torres. "It's been a long time." The familiarity in his voice was worse than Torres's threats, a reminder of the trust she had once placed in this man, the loyalty she had given to an organization that had ultimately betrayed everything it claimed to represent. "Marcus," she replied, her voice carefully neutral. Webb smiled, that same cold smile she remembered from their final meeting 8 years ago. "You've done well for yourself. Library work suits you. Quiet, anonymous, surrounded by information, but trusted with none of it. Very clever." He opened his own folder, revealing more recent surveillance photos. "But not clever enough. We know you kept files, Sarah. We know you have evidence that certain people would prefer to remain buried. The question is, what do you want?" The directness of the question surprised her. This wasn't an interrogation anymore. This was a negotiation. Sarah studied Webb's face, looking for tells, for signs of weakness or desperation. What she saw was a man under tremendous pressure, someone who had run out of options and was now forced to deal directly with a problem he had hoped would simply disappear. "What I want," Sarah said slowly, "is to continue my quiet life as a librarian in Boston. What I want is for federal agents to stop following me, photographing me, and treating me like a terrorist." She paused, letting her words sink in. "What I want is the same thing I've wanted for 8 years, to be left alone." Webb nodded as if he had expected this response. "That can be arranged. But first, we need those files, Sarah. All of them. Every copy, every backup, every insurance policy you've hidden away. Nightingale needs to stay buried permanently." The admission was significant. Webb wasn't denying the program's existence anymore. wasn't pretending that the files contained nothing more than routine intelligence reports. He was acknowledging that the stakes were high enough to risk exposing himself to a former agent who had every reason to hate him. "And if I refuse?" Sarah asked. Webb's expression grew darker. "Then this conversation becomes very different very quickly. There are national security implications here that go far beyond your personal comfort." The threat was real, Sarah knew. Webb had the resources and the connections to make her disappear completely, to erase her new identity just as thoroughly as she had erased her old one. But he also had vulnerabilities, pressure points that could be exploited if she played her cards correctly. "I need guarantees," Sarah said finally. "Written guarantees that I'll be left alone permanently, new identity documents, financial security, and most importantly, protection from anyone who might decide that loose ends need to be tied up permanently." Webb considered this for a moment. "That can be arranged. But the files, Sarah, we need them today. All of them." Sarah nodded slowly, as if reaching a difficult decision. "They're in the library," she said, "hidden in a place where no one would think to look for classified CIA documents." The admission seemed to relax something in Webb's posture. After 8 years of wondering, of losing sleep over what Sarah Chen might do with the information she possessed, he was finally getting the resolution he needed. "Where specifically?" Torres asked, leaning forward eagerly. Sarah looked at both men, memorizing their faces, their expressions, their body language. "In a few hours, this would all be over, one way or another." "I'll have to show you," she said. "The hiding place is sophisticated." 2 hours later, Sarah found herself back in the Boston Public Library, but this time she wasn't alone. Webb and Torres flanked her as she walked through the familiar aisles, past patrons who had no idea they were witnessing what might be the final chapter of one of the CIA's most closely guarded secrets. The late afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows, casting the same long shadows Sarah had grown to love during her 8 years of exile. But today, those shadows felt ominous, like dark fingers reaching out to drag her back into a world she had tried so desperately to escape. They reached the fiction section, and Sarah paused in front of shelf 8-1-54. American Literature, Edgar Allan Poe, Tales of Mystery and Imagination. How fitting, she thought, that the evidence of America's surveillance state should be hidden inside the works of a writer who understood the corrupting nature of guilt and paranoia. She pulled out the thick, leather-bound volume, its weight familiar in her hands after years of careful maintenance. "Inside this book," she said, "are copies of every Nightingale document, every surveillance report, every illegal wiretap authorization, everything that could destroy careers, topple governments, and send powerful men to prison for the rest of their lives." Webb reached for the book, but Sarah pulled it back slightly. "First, I want to see the guarantee documents you promised. The new identity papers, the financial arrangements, the protection agreements." Her voice carried the authority of someone who had spent years negotiating with dangerous men in dark rooms. Webb nodded to Torres, who produced a manila envelope from inside his jacket. Sarah examined the documents quickly but thoroughly, her trained eye catching details that would escape civilian notice. Everything appeared to be legitimate. New social security number, birth certificate, passport, even a complete credit history for her new identity. There was also a bank routing number for an account containing enough money to ensure her comfortable retirement. "Satisfied?" Webb asked. Sarah nodded and handed him the book. He opened it carefully, revealing the hollowed-out interior where dozens of flash drives and printed documents had been stored like toxic secrets waiting to poison whoever disturbed them. But as Webb lifted out the first flash drive, Sarah's expression changed from resignation to something that might have been satisfaction. "There's just one thing you should know, Marcus," she said quietly. "Those aren't the real files." The words hit Webb like a physical blow. His hands froze over the hollowed-out book, his face going pale as the implications sank in. "What do you mean?" he whispered. Sarah's smile was cold, professional, the expression of an intelligence analyst who had just executed a perfect misdirection. I mean, those drives contain nothing but library inventory databases and overdue book reports. The real Nightingale files, the ones with all the juicy details about illegal surveillance and constitutional violations, those are somewhere much safer. Torres reached for his weapon, but Webb held up a hand to stop him. They were in a public library, surrounded by witnesses. Violence here would create more problems than it solved. Where? Webb asked, his voice tight with controlled fury. Sarah looked around the library one last time, at the patrons reading quietly at wooden tables, at the sunlight streaming through windows that had watched over Boston for more than a century. "They're with a journalist," she said simply. "Someone who understands their value and has the resources to ensure they see the light of day if anything happens to me. Insurance, Marcus. Something you taught me the importance of during my time at Langley." The revelation that Sarah had outsourced her insurance policy to the press sent shockwaves through Webb's carefully constructed plans. A journalist with access to classified materials was exponentially more dangerous than a rogue analyst hiding in a library. Journalists had editors, legal departments, constitutional protections, and most importantly, the ability to turn classified secrets into front-page headlines that could topple governments. "Who?" Webb demanded, but Sarah just shook her head. "That information stays with me until I'm safely relocated with my new identity and enough distance between us that you'll never find me again." She paused, watching his face carefully. "Indeed, but I will say this. The journalist in question has already been briefed on the contents of the files and has prepared preliminary articles ready for publication. If I miss my scheduled check-in calls, or if I have any kind of unfortunate accident, those articles go live immediately." The threat was elegantly simple and utterly devastating. Webb had spent decades building his power base, cultivating relationships, accumulating leverage over politicians and judges. But all of that would evaporate the moment Project Nightingale became public knowledge. Webb's mind raced through possibilities, calculating odds, assessing options. He could have Sarah detained indefinitely, could use enhanced interrogation techniques to extract the journalist's identity. But that would take time, and time was a luxury he no longer possessed. If Sarah had truly prepared deadman switches and automated publication systems, then any delay could trigger the very exposure he was trying to prevent. "What do you want?" he asked finally, the question carrying the weight of complete defeat. Sarah looked at him for a long moment, seeing not the powerful director who had once controlled her fate, but simply another desperate man trying to protect secrets that should never have existed in the first place. "I want my new identity documents to be genuine, not forgeries that will disintegrate under scrutiny," she said. "I want the financial arrangements to be permanent and untraceable, and I want absolute assurance that no one from any agency will ever come looking for me again." She paused. "In exchange, the journalist will keep the files as insurance but won't publish unless you force their hand. A Cold War, Marcus. The kind you understand." 3 days later, Sarah Chen ceased to exist. The woman who boarded a flight to Portland under a different name carried nothing but a single suitcase and the satisfaction of knowing that the most dangerous secrets in America were safely beyond the reach of those who had created them. She had played a long game, had spent 8 years preparing for this moment, and had emerged victorious against opponents who had vastly underestimated her intelligence and determination. As the plane lifted off from Logan Airport, she looked down at Boston one last time, at the city where she had found refuge and ultimately her freedom. The library would miss her, she knew. There would be questions about her sudden disappearance, concerns from co-workers who had thought they knew the quiet librarian who stamped their books. But those questions would fade, as all questions eventually do, buried under the weight of daily life and the assumption that some people simply choose to start over somewhere else. In Washington, Director Webb returned to his office knowing that his career, his power, perhaps even his freedom, now depended on the continued silence of a woman whose real name he would never learn.